The moon cast an eerie glow over the lake, turning its once calm surface into a canvas of rippling shadows. My heart raced as I stood at the edge, the water lapping at my feet. A figure emerged from the depths, pale and lifeless, its eyes staring blankly into the void. I recognized the face. Emily, the sweet girl who had gone missing 2 weeks ago. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, the horrifying realization washing over me like a tidal wave. This was no accident. The lake was a graveyard. It all began a month ago, in the sleepy town of Clearwater. Known for its pristine lake and charming community, Clearwater was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing ever went wrong. I had grown up here, and after college, I returned to take over my father's position as the town's sheriff. It was a quiet job, or so I thought. The first sign of trouble came when Emily, a bright and cheerful high school student, disappeared without a trace. Her parents were frantic, and the entire town rallied together to search for her. We combed through the woods, questioned everyone who might have seen her, and even dragged the lake. But there was no sign of Emily. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. 2 weeks later, another person went missing. Mark, a local fisherman. This time, the town was gripped with fear. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the once tranquil community was on edge. I intensified the search efforts, bringing in more resources, but again, we found nothing. It was as if the lake had swallowed them whole. Then came the night that changed everything. I was at the station, going over the case files for the 100th time, when I received a call from old Mrs. Dawson, who lived by the lake. She was hysterical, claiming she had seen something moving in the water. I rushed over, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. When I arrived, Mrs. Dawson was standing at the edge of the lake, pointing with a trembling hand. "There, do you see it?" she cried. I squinted into the darkness, my flashlight barely piercing the thick fog that had settled over the water. At first, I saw nothing, but then a shape began to emerge, something pale and ghostly, bobbing just beneath the surface. I waded into the water, the cold seeping through my boots. As I got closer, the shape became clearer, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it was a body. Emily's body. Her face was contorted in a grimace of terror, her hands bound with rope. I pulled her to the shore, my mind reeling. This was no accident. Someone had killed her and dumped her in the lake. The next morning, the town was in a frenzy. The news of Emily's body being found spread quickly, and people began to panic. The local newspaper ran a headline, "Killer among us?" Everyone was a suspect, and trust began to erode. As the sheriff, it was my job to find the truth, but the deeper I dug, the more I realized how little I knew about the people I had grown up with. I started with Emily's friends and family, hoping to find some clue that would lead me to her killer. Her parents were devastated, and her friends were equally distraught. They described Emily as a kind, happy girl with no enemies. But one name kept coming up, Jake, her ex-boyfriend. They had broken up a few months before her disappearance, and according to her friends, it had not ended well. I brought Jake in for questioning. He was a tall, brooding young man with a quick temper. He denied any involvement in Emily's death, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. I pressed him harder, but he stuck to his story. He hadn't seen Emily since their breakup. With no solid evidence, I had to let him go, but I kept an eye on him, hoping he would slip up. Meanwhile, the town grew more paranoid. People started locking their doors, children were kept inside, and everyone looked at their neighbors with suspicion. A week later, another body surfaced. This time, it was Mark, the fisherman. Like Emily, his hands were bound, and his face bore the same expression of terror. The similarities between the two cases were undeniable. We had a serial killer on our hands. The discovery of Mark's body sent shockwaves through the community. The picturesque lake, once a symbol of tranquility, was now seen as a place of death. I worked tirelessly, piecing together the evidence, interviewing anyone who might have information, but every lead seemed to dead end. One night, as I was going over the files again, I noticed something I had overlooked before, a connection between Emily and Mark. They both had volunteered at the same community center, helping out with local events. It was a tenuous link, but it was the only lead I had. I visited the community center, hoping to find something that would tie the two victims together. The director, a woman named Karen, was helpful but had little information. She confirmed that both Emily and Mark had been regular volunteers, but she couldn't think of any reason why someone would target them. Frustrated and running out of options, I decided to dig into the town's history. Clearwater had always seemed idyllic, but every town has its secrets. I pored over old newspapers and town records, looking for anything that might explain the recent horrors. That's when I stumbled upon an old article from the 1970s. It detailed a series of mysterious disappearances that had occurred over a span of 5 years. Young men and women had vanished without a trace, their bodies never found. The disappearances had stopped abruptly, and the town had moved on, but the parallels to the current situation were too striking to ignore. I reached out to some of the older residents, hoping they might remember something about those dark years. Most were reluctant to talk, but one name kept coming up: Henry Caldwell, a local historian who had been obsessed with the disappearances. I found Henry living in a small cabin on the outskirts of town. He was an eccentric old man, but his mind was sharp. When I asked him about the disappearances, his eyes lit up with a strange intensity. "Those were dark times," he said, his voice gravelly. "People just vanished, and the town did nothing. They wanted to forget, to pretend it wasn't happening." I showed him pictures of Emily and Mark, and his expression grew grim. "It's happening again, isn't it?" I nodded, and he sighed heavily. "There's something you need to see," he said, leading me to a dusty bookshelf. He pulled out an old, leather-bound journal and handed it to me. "This belonged to my father," he explained. "He was the sheriff back then. He kept detailed notes on the disappearances, but no one believed him. They thought he was crazy." I flipped through the journal, my heart racing as I read. It detailed his father's investigation into the disappearances, describing a pattern that pointed to a series of ritualistic killings. The entries grew more frantic, more desperate, as he delved deeper into the town's dark underbelly. One name kept appearing in the journal: Arthur Blackwood, a prominent businessman who had owned much of the land around the lake. According to Henry's father, Blackwood had been involved in some sort of cult, performing dark rituals in the dead of night. But before he could gather enough evidence, Blackwood had died in a mysterious fire, and the case was closed. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. Could it be that someone was continuing Blackwood's dark legacy? I had to find out. I spent the next few days investigating Blackwood's history, but much of it had been erased or covered up. However, I found an old photograph of him standing in front of his mansion, a mansion that still stood, abandoned, on the outskirts of town. That night, I decided to visit the mansion, armed with a flashlight and a sense of foreboding. I made my way through the overgrown path that led to the dilapidated building. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the trees seemed to whisper warnings as I passed. The mansion loomed before me, its windows dark and empty. I pushed open the heavy front door, and it creaked ominously. Inside, the air was stale, and the floors were covered in a thick layer of dust. I moved cautiously, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. In the basement, I found what I had been dreading: a hidden room filled with symbols and artifacts that spoke of dark rituals. The walls were lined with photographs of the missing people, including Emily and Mark. My heart pounded as I realized I was standing in the lair of a killer. A noise behind me made me spin around, and there, in the doorway, stood Jake. His eyes were wild, and he held a knife in his hand. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "You're ruining everything." "Jake, put the knife down," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We can talk about this." But he lunged at me. I struggled. The room was small, and I knocked over shelves and artifacts as we fought. Finally, I managed to disarm him, pinning him to the ground. As I caught my breath, Jake began to laugh, a hollow, chilling sound. "You think it's over," he said, his eyes glinting with madness. "You have no idea what's coming." I called for backup, and Jake was taken into custody. Under interrogation, he revealed that he had been following in Blackwood's footsteps, continuing the rituals to appease the spirits of the lake. He believed that the disappearances and deaths were necessary to maintain the town's prosperity. The truth was even more horrifying than I had imagined. The idyllic town of Clearwater had been built on a foundation of dark secrets and blood. The lake, once a symbol of peace, was now a reminder of the horrors that lay beneath the surface. In the weeks that followed, the town tried to move on, but the scars ran deep. I continued to serve as sheriff, but the innocence of Clearwater was forever shattered. The bodies of Emily and Mark were given proper burials, and the community mourned their loss. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only uncovered part of the truth. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many dark corners left unexplored. But I knew one thing for certain. Beneath the surface of Clearwater's picturesque facade, something evil had been lurking all along, and it wasn't finished yet.